Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another session. This time, looking at Africa's framework, development framework, which is helping us with the objective, was the mission of creating the Africa that we want. It is very timely that we are having this discussion here in Egypt at the time when the head of the African Union is the president of Egypt. I think 2063 is really a very ambitious, bold, but importantly, African-driven agenda. It's we ourselves who said, what is it that we do to create the continent that we want, a continent which is, as they say, is at peace with itself, is integrated, and is helping African countries and their peoples provide the meaningful socio-economic environment within which we'll all thrive. As I said, it's ambitious. It is not in certain ways unrelated to the SDGs. The SDGs are really a universal framework, but this is Africa's own developed framework, which is consistent with the SDGs, but it is one which is really within our own grasp, which I believe personally, as a Pan-Africanist, as somebody involved in development over the years, that it is realistic, the way they put it together, and the implementation schedule in which they are looking at it every 10 years. So it is not, we're not here and saying we are doing a plan for 2063, when a lot of people around here, some of us who are old, will not be around anyway. So we are saying we will implement it on a 10-year gap. So we, in the Ibrahim Foundation, are aware of the importance of this framework, the relevance of this framework, the utility of this framework. And therefore, we are tying progress and implementation. We are trying to capture where we are on this. And that's the first time that we are having the index tailored in such a manner. And my colleague, Yannick, who presented the earlier session in terms of where the index shows, will now drill down and concretely show you what our findings are and how we can continue to use the index to accompany and monitor really where we are on this important framework. So we will have our colleague from ambassador from Cameroon, who made a great plea today as to what Africa should be, and certainly also to our DG of ECS, who also said that this is the jewel we have. And to really realize what this jewel is, let us see how we clean it up, how we move it up. You know, a jewel is always a jewel. You know, you cannot taint a jewel, but you can clean it up. And I think this is a matter of saying, let's have faith in our continent. This is what the continent can do. This is what the continent can represent. So to his sons and daughters. So Yannick, I will let you, and to help us really have a meaningful discussion on this, we really thank ECS for bringing a whole array of African ambassadors, because this is the Africa we are trying to create, and who best really to have a say in this are the ambassadors, because you are the ones actually who put it together under the leadership of our presidents, including President Sisi. So, Mr. Moderator, thank you. My role is simply to say a few words as chairperson, but we'll let you drive. You would like to moderate this session, but I will pass on to my colleague, Yannick, who, as I said, is head of our research, and we are very conscious of the importance of this framework, and therefore we have really put together a methodology to see how we capture progress that's been made. Not only the 2063, but including the SDGs also. So Yannick, you have the floor.
Hello? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Abdoulie, Your Excellencies. It's an honor to present in front of you. So what I'm going to do is very briefly present the findings of our latest report, which we launched on Tuesday. Very briefly, this covers Agenda 2063, the relationship with the SDGs and public governance in Africa, and also highlight some of the statistical capacity deficits at the moment that we feel from the research need to be addressed. I will try and go a little bit slower than last time, as I think the translators have asked me to be a bit slower, especially with talking with the numbers. I'm sure you are all aware of Agenda 2063, but perhaps as background to some of the discussions, I'll very briefly talk about the background to Agenda 2063 and then Agenda 2030. Agenda 2063 is the continent's 50-year strategic framework to guide Africa's development. It is Africa's blueprint for transforming the continent. It is a strategic framework that aims to deliver the goal of inclusive and sustainable development. It's built around the Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. The agenda as such is characterized by democracy, cultural identity, and continental integration. And as you can see here, there are 7 main aspirations of the agenda. Aspiration 3, which talks about good governance, is seen as a critical enabler for the other aspirations. How is this going to be achieved? There's a number of different actors involved in this, and I will talk a little bit more in a moment about some of the monitoring mechanisms, and I'm sure the ambassadors will have much more knowledge than myself of how this is all being implemented at country level. Before I go into the comparison with Agenda 2030 and the SDGs and discuss some of the overlaps between them, just to first say that the Agenda 2063 is guided by 5 10-year implementation plans. The first 10-year implementation plan is 2014 to 2023. It covers several goals and priority areas, 20 goals, in fact, as you can see on the screen here, and 39 priority areas which are spread across the aspirations. Each priority area comes with targets. These are 255 different targets, and 63 have been assigned core indicators. I'll go into a little bit more detail about this shortly. There is a domestication agenda. It's multi-layered implementation at the national level, regional economic community level, and continental level. The SDGs, encapsulated by Agenda 2030, there are strong overlaps. However, there is a stronger emphasis on climate change-related issues and inequalities. It covers 3 core dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. And it's measured across 17 SDGs, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Now, there is quite a lot of overlap between the goals, and this is mainly also because the Agenda 2030 was partly based on the Common African Position. So there is quite a large amount of overlap between the agendas, and therefore an opportunity to move forward to achieving the targets of both simultaneously. The areas where Agenda 2030 does not cover are the Pan-African ones of continental integration or culture, for example. Obviously, it's a global agenda. The challenge of monitoring both is going to be a challenge. There are several different actors involved here, as I mentioned, at the national level, regional economic community level, at the African Union level. There are a few collaborative overlapping areas of monitoring. There's the Africa Regional Forum on Sustainable Development, which is initiated by UNECA. The UN and the AU also have the framework on implementation of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. Despite this, there are several different monitoring mechanisms and several different actors going on. So one could argue that the process may lack some clarity at the moment in terms of who is responsible for what. Public governance is at the heart of both agendas, and as I mentioned very briefly in answering a question earlier, there is a large overlap with the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. 85.7% of Agenda 2063 aspirations, so 6 out of 7, are linked to governance measures as included in the Mo Ibrahim Foundation's Governance Index, and just over 70% of the SDGs, or 12 out of 16, are linked to the index. So at the moment, the index can give some insights into progress so far in terms of reaching some of these targets, and I will discuss some overlapping themes between them and give you some results from the Ibrahim Index. As I mentioned, public governance does seem to be at the heart of these agendas, and that is because they are citizen-driven agendas. The most comprehensive study so far on the SDGs and Africa's performance towards achieving the SDGs has been done by the Africa SDG Index, which is developed by the Africa SDG Center, which is based in Kigali. We ran an exercise where we compared the scores in terms of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation's Governance Index, overall performance, and also the scores of the Africa SDG Index. Now, they're highly related. There's a very strong correlation between these. These would suggest that good governance is essential to achieving the SDGs. And because there's such a strong overlap with the SDGs and Agenda 2063, it would suggest that good governance is at the heart of both. I'm going to very briefly go through some overlapping themes and say what the index says about some of the progress in these areas. Some of this overlaps with some of the key findings I already discussed. This is just a bit of background for a discussion on Agenda 2063 in general. The first is access to and quality of education. One of the priority areas in Agenda 2063 is education and science, technology, and innovation, skills revolution. In Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, it's covered in SDG 4, which is quality education. In the Ibrahim Index, we have an education subcategory, so there's quite a large overlap between the three frameworks. As I mentioned in my key findings presentation previously, there's been a lot of progress in enrollment in Africa. So a lot of countries are improving in tertiary education enrollment, secondary education enrollments, and primary school completion. There's also an increase in human resources in primary schools. The main indicators that are showing decline since 2014, which is when countries started implementing the first 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, are the indicators measuring education quality and the alignment of education to market needs. Another overlapping theme in all three frameworks is health and nutrition. Now, Africa's made very big progress, as the index shows, in areas of goals which are still related to the Millennium Development Goals, the previous global goals. Now, these are things like maternal mortality, child mortality, antiretroviral treatment provision, for example. One of the indicators that has been declining in health is satisfaction with health provision. This is a public perception indicator, which basically demonstrates that, on average, some citizens are unhappy with the provision of health services. This might point to a lack of data, for example, in measuring the capacity of health infrastructures to deal with an ever-growing population, or it could be for other reasons. What the indicators in the index do show is that there are very strong relationships in improving health with indicators such as infrastructure relating to electricity supply and satisfaction with water and sanitation services. So these are areas which countries that are doing well in health are also doing well in these infrastructure variables. So perhaps this is some guidance for stakeholders into how to improve health outcomes. There's also a lot of lack of data in terms of affordability of health services at the moment. Another overlapping theme in both agendas is women and youth inclusion. Now, the Ibrahim Index shows that gender is one of the most improved areas for Africa. There's a lot more gender equality, however, it does vary significantly between regions. In terms of youth, One of the indicators in the Ibrahim Index, which measures the promotion of socio-economic integration of youth, has shown decline on average. Now, this measures whether governments are putting in place policies to increase the socio-economic integration of youth. Finally, there is a large overlap in both agendas in terms of prosperity and economic opportunity. Now, I already talked a little bit in the previous key findings of the index that sustainable economic opportunity has been stalling, really, on the continent on average. This is a large priority in Agenda 2063, which focuses on income, jobs, and decent work, and also infrastructure issues such as modern and livable habitats, water security, agricultural productivity, and production. One of the things the index does point to is the fact that many African countries are currently not diversified enough in terms of their economies. This is on average of the 102 indicators, diversification of exports is the lowest performing indicator in the entire index. And this is a proxy to measure whether countries' economies are diversified. So the scores here are very low. Again, there's quite a lot of regional variation. North African countries tend to score a lot better in this indicator than the rest of Africa. So there are some highlights in terms of what the index says in terms of where Africa is so far in terms of the implementation of the first 10-year plan and progress towards targets. But one of the things that we discussed in the last session as well is the lack of data. And I would encourage you to read the entire chapter 3 of our new report, which covers statistical capacity on the continent. But one of the key findings we have found is that there is a real lack of data at the moment to measure the goals. I'll come back to that other slide in a minute. So Agenda 2063 has, the first 10-year implementation plan has 255 targets. At the moment, after research we've done, we found that not all of these are necessarily quantifiable with data. In fact, only just over 50% are quantifiable with statistical data. A lot of the targets are qualitative and they're not currently measurable. I'll try and give you a couple of examples. So one target is the African Mineral Development Center is fully operational. Now, currently this is not defined. What does fully operational mean and how do you measure that? So according to the research, there is still a lot of work to do in actually making the targets quantifiable so that Africa can actually measure its progress towards some of these targets. In terms of the SDGs, the indicators are more quantifiable. However, there is a severe lack of data. Under 40% of the total of indicators are currently covered for Africa. There are several indicators which have less than 30%, SDGs which have less than 30% of availability. SDGs 1, no poverty, for example. SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. There's only 6 SDGs which have over 50% of data coverage for Africa. SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, health and well-being, SDG 4, quality education, for example. These are quite stark figures, however, in terms of data availability, and it shows that at the moment it's not possible to accurately measure progress towards the goals. So that's the data availability in terms of what's available for the continent to measure progress towards Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. In terms of general data coverage, publicly available data in terms of vital statistics, so civil registration, for example, or population. Now, these have all declined. So this is publicly available data since 2015. The general trend is declining. So there's no data available in terms of some birth registrations or death registrations. Now, it's impossible to measure some of the targets in the SDGs or Agenda 2063, which focus on, for example, improving health services for 30% of the population. Now, if there's no data on how many on the population, then it's impossible to measure progress towards some of the targets. Civil registration is a vital step in assessing the targets of the agendas. At the moment, the UN stats database on birth registration systems show that only 8 African countries have a birth registration system with a coverage rate higher than 90% in the last 10 years. In terms of death registration, there's only 3 countries. Now, this is currently the only available data that is on the UN website. So without this data, it's going to be impossible to measure progress towards the goals. I think I will leave it at that as some background for the discussions.
Thank you for that overview, and I will let our Dean moderate this session. Before doing that, a few words really. I think there are two frameworks here. We're talking of Agenda 2063 and SDGs. Africa 23 is what Africa put its head together, and we came up with a framework. SDG is a universal global agenda. And I think really in assessing these two, we'll just see to what extent Agenda 2063 is also a framework to achieve the SDGs. You know, my colleague who chaired here was saying, given the lack of data, you know, these reporting lines are just too cumbersome for Africa. You know, this is bothering us. So I think moving forward, this is something that we should see. We just see to what extent is Agenda 2063 incorporating and encompassing what the aspirations of SDG Agenda 2030, and then the data that we require, the reporting that is then centralized, is harmonized, you know, moving forward. And I think maybe you should lead that debate here and really try to see how you could help African Union, you know, engage in this harmonization process. I think it's important that we do that. Having said that, I think now we will leave it to the frontline participants in this equation, you know, the countries, and represented, ably represented here by the ambassadors, and hear your reaction to this carrying forward. And to help us capture this, I will hand over to the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps here to moderate this session. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for a brother from the Mo initiative for the presentation. I think the debate that has been going on since this morning about the indexes and the parameters that are taken into account to report shows that there is a variety of perception in the way we read the development efforts for Africa. I would just put aside those figures and the debates and just point to 2 or 3 things. While we are celebrating Africa as a continent of the present, of the future, we have some pictures that speak more than words. We think of those youths that are fleeing Africa through Mediterranean and through other means to go to places where they are not even sure to have the same quality of life that what they left in Africa. But why are they doing that if Africa really is the future, the continent of the future? This is one. Second, while we notice and record the rush towards Africa by investors and by other major actors of the global market, we have put ourselves, some goals. First of it is integration of Africa. But what do we see? The trend is that the same people that are rushing to Africa to look for the resources, they carefully avoid engaging with Africa as an integrated and united continent. And they will come and try and build the relationship on the reverse, which is, you'll see the fora, China, Africa, Japan, Africa, India, Africa, and you'll see our leaders floating, rushing to Japan for the forum. So there lies, one of the peculiarities. So now, the agenda for development of Africa, which is the 2063 agenda, which by and large, I think, takes into account the SDGs goals, but also has tried as far as we could to tailor it according to our real needs. Why is it that we have a problem to see it implemented? Here lies the responsibility of governments. And this responsibility, we need to really pinpoint the reason why there is failure in implementation. Or not failure, but there is lack of resilience, I would say. That's the reason why I think in this panel, we are not going to go into discussion about the data or the details and this, but I will invite my colleagues to address some of the real challenges that we think are the challenges of Africa that need to be addressed, and to see how and if our governments are really putting in place what it takes to achieve them. That would be our response to the dissatisfaction that we see from our youth that are leaving Africa in numbers. So, first item, what are the main problems that keep Africa, prevent Africa from frog lapping? And for that, I will want to call upon our brother, ambassador of Ghana, maybe to address this issue and to give us some cues about that. I say, what are the main problems, the main hindrance that keep Africa away from the necessary action that are to be targeted to overlap? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are many aspects of the challenges that we face in addressing or moving towards the targets that we have set, whether you look under the Agenda 2063 or the SDGs. And we have looked at the commonalities that we find in them. But I'd like to bring this home to specific issues as Mr. Moderator, you have alluded to. I would want to start looking at the issue of health. The health challenges I saw from the presentation by Yannick earlier, that it looks like that is one area where there seems to be some improvement generally. But I think when we come to look at specifics, we will realize that we should not be deceived by the trends. There are still serious challenges, and I will bring our minds to specific issues concerning health. And there, let's start looking at malaria, for instance. Early this year, in April or so, the African Union moved that we launch what we call zero malaria, and it says zero malaria starts with me. Health in general, we've looked at specific diseases, and we have very good results. If we look under the MDGs, we could pat ourselves in the back as having been successful in addressing specific diseases or health challenges. But as a whole, as the WHO put it, we need to look at a more holistic, intersectorial, not just multi-sectorial, because multi-sectorial you could have many sectors and yet they are not interlinked. But you're looking at the intersectorial approaches. Malaria, as the example that I said, has to do with issues of the environment, because if we don't take care of the breeding grounds of the major vector, then we have serious problems of malaria prevalence. But what are the sectors? You can't deal with malaria prevention, for instance, without looking at the environmental issues, without looking at where they are breeding, sanitation issues. What are the issues that need to be addressed? So the government has a role to play. You bring it to the community level, the communities have roles to play, and the individual have roles to play. Breeding grounds of mosquitoes are important to address by all sectors and by all levels, governments, regional or community level, and the individual. It must be related to proper education. So this is the linkages that governments should focus on. And education, not just in campaigns, but I'm using malaria as an example, but it applies to many cases of specific diseases. We need to look at all the different sectors, the role they would play, and we're looking at all the players from governments, private sector, community, as well as the individuals, and ensure that we have the proper education, the understanding, but we also make provision for what is required. And that is the role of our governments, to create that environment, but also promote that education that is required for the proper understanding. What about the infrastructure? So developing health systems that are very important to address this is some of the issues that we need to face. So we are looking at issues of sanitation, we're looking at the issues of environment, and of course, when we talk about sanitation these days, we can't also forget about the impact of climate change. In Ghana, for instance, the southern part of Ghana, Accra, and those areas, normally by now the rains have stopped. But you may see on the news, last week, floods everywhere. We have mudslides in some areas, and floods which have occurred, but because there are no proper drainages, but the drainages have been choked because individuals don't care about where they throw their trash. And when even government puts in the necessary infrastructure, the individuals need to protect it. So it is very important that these linkages, these intersectorial level linkages all come to play, And when we are assessing the impact or what government has done or should do to be able to bring malaria eradication as an example, then we should have indicators that attempt to measure or look at all the different sectors, whether they are properly in place to address them. There are other diseases we can talk about, but I think for the purpose of time, I want to end here to emphasize the need for a holistic approach and looking at the different levels. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Identifying the main challenges in the health sector is good, but also putting in place programs, integrated programs that will address those issues are more important. And here we would like to acknowledge the recent decision by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to address the issue of HCV and also anemia on children. This program is one of the programs that we think is well designed to address one of the issues that keep Africa back. So we also, Excellency, you spoke about infrastructure. I think one of the lacking factors essentially is, lack of access to electricity. No country, no region in the world develop without, the availability of clean and sufficient energy to, fuel the development needs. There also, I think many opportunities are there, and in some cases, some contentious issues would be a reason to develop this sector. And here I think about the Renaissance Dam and the other dams in Africa. That could be a possibility to bring in the know-how of all our countries and to build integrated infrastructure that would be, beneficial for the whole of Africa. This being said, we also have to maybe think about now, on which assets Africa could, build a sustainable, not only the vision, because the vision is there, a sustainable way of action that could accelerate and widen the scope of the effort that we are doing to achieve our agendas. And here, I would like to call upon our brother from Liberia to give us some insight about it.
Thank you, Excellency. Since this morning, our discourse has been very interesting. If Africa is to be the future, Africa has to be prepared for it. If we are not prepared for it, then the future will not be ours. It is important to point out that Africa has several assets that could be used in a sustainable development. I wish to point out as one of those assets are the youth of Africa. We have a very youthful population. But how can they be so important in Africa's development? There has to be preparation. governments in Africa must make sure that the people are prepared for the future. In terms of governance, you talk about election, human rights, and all the others. But it is important that the human potential is developed so that it can be able to help sustain society. This is why African governments must be able to put enough money in their education budget to make sure that our youth are educated. Today, there's nothing you can do in terms of development without an infrastructure. You could talk about electricity. How are you going to build industries if you don't have electricity? This is very important. I say this coming from Liberia. We had a 14-year civil conflict, and all of our infrastructures were destroyed. The question of electricity is so important. Today, our world is a global village. How do you connect to that? It is important that you have electricity to do that. So the youth, the education of the youth is so important that they can be able to take over the question of governance, of leading tomorrow, that they are the prosperity of tomorrow. How do they do that? They must be prepared to take on the responsibility of states, of governance. So it is very important as an asset that our youth are educated to the extent in the area of sciences, technology, so that industries can be put into place. That tomorrow when we are talking about Africa being the future, is Africa ready with the necessary industries tomorrow that can man all of our natural resources to make us better? So I know that coming from Liberia, the government is putting its resources into education. You are talking about capacity building, making sure that the sciences and IT are those areas where emphasis are placed, because those are the ones that bring the industry. The sciences are very important. Yes, social science might be important, but it is important for us to make sure that our children, the future of the continent, they are ready to compete with their counterpart in other places. Africa has resources. I was once in Morocco and attended a meeting, and there was an expert talking about Africa can feed the world, but its water resources are not in the right place. For instance, Liberia has rain water all year round, and we still have not been able to deal with the question of sustainable and food security. So these things are important that government put emphasis in the area that tomorrow is the future. So we think in terms of having the youth as an asset, because human resources is so important in our development. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Of course, human resources are, important, but we have one other assets that we need to tap into. They are the women, the empowerment of women. And I'm sure that our brother from Angola would be in a position to address this issue and tell us in his view, what can be, done to take advantage of this very important asset of the human employment.
Thank you. Ambassador, for me, I think I give you these human issues, but I want to reinforce the need about the integration. I think it's very important, Dayadin, to accelerate our regional integration. And it's a very good dimension to also accelerate our development. Another thing that I think is very important in this challenge is assure also our own security through African Union and through our African mechanism. And I think for Egypt, our need is also to reinforce and to develop the cooperation South-South. What kind of value the Egypt is possible to agree in our country? What kind of industry you can to help to reinforce African development? I think these three dimensions is for me one of the key issues for our cooperation for this Agenda 2063.
Thank you, sir. Of course, integration is the master word. And as you said, we need to put in place all the means, what it takes to not only reinforce the integration, but also deepen it, so that Africa would be considered like, as they say, one Africa. Now we are talking about the main priorities that each country will see as priority. We should consider reinforcing the integration as one of the means that would really force our partners to consider the welfare of all as being the welfare of the continent. Of course, one of the points that are also very crucial is the question of security, combating terrorism, and when we read, our brother from the Ibrahim Foundation made it very clear that the welfare of the countries that compose Africa are very well related to the state of, security and peace. That issue, I think our brother from the Embassy of Nigeria, Mr. Ahmed Gusau, will give some hints about, what Nigeria, as one of the leading economies in the continent, has done to see that they take, measures on this level to ensure that it would help for the boosting of the economy.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for giving me the opportunity to talk on this issue. Indeed, security is vital for stability, peace, and security in Africa. Take into cognizance what is happening today in Libya, and as highlighted by His Excellency, the illegal migration of our teeming youth from Africa to Europe, not knowing actually what they are going to do there. On the way, they encountered so many problems relating to drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, and as well as being enslaved in Libya. But security is not only restricted to Libya alone. You look at sub-Saharan Africa, the Burkina Faso, the Mali, and by extension, the Lake Chad region. Lake Chad region today is experiencing serious issue relating to terrorism. The Boko Haram, as we are all aware, is there for the past 5 years. Concerted efforts are being made by Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger Republic, Chad, and also with the assistance of Benin Republic to fight Boko Haram. And it's not only Boko Haram that is a terrorist organization in Africa. We have Al-Shabaab here, we have Muslim Brotherhood, and other terrorist organizations in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and other parts of Africa. Yes, concerted efforts are being made, but we have limitations. Limitation in the sense that when you look at what is happening in Great Chad Basin, Lake Chad Basin, you see the climate change aspect is affecting the flow of water from various rivers into Lake Chad, thereby causing serious socio-economic problem in the region, making fighting Boko Haram very difficult scenario. But as highlighted also by His Excellency, when he discussed the issue of women education, my colleague also from Liberia also discussed the issue of education. You see, there is a saying in our society, when you educate a woman, you are educating a society. When you educate a man, you are only educating him. So the emphasis is to try to educate the youth, but at the same time with special emphasis to educate the women, with a view also to provide, government should provide them with all the necessary assistance with which they can help develop themselves, at the same time develop the society. For Africa to achieve the 2063 agenda, there is need for integration. Fortunately, we have recently, this agreement was signed, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is to facilitate economic integration and as well to facilitate movement of persons, goods and services from one place to another. This, I believe, will go a long way in helping to develop Africa, engage our youth, and at the same time, create an environment where each and everyone can move freely within the continent. But for us to achieve that also, there is need for us to consider the issue of free movement of persons without visa within the African continent. Because it is only then that one person can move from one point to another without being asked to go for any serious documentation. So integration of Africa is on the right track by signing of Africa Free Continental Trade Zone. But care must be also taken to ensure that Africans using the modern technology should not use it for acts of terrorism. Internet, in this case, should be closely monitored to ensure that at least those that are using it for good can use it for good. Those that are using it for bad can be monitored, fished out, and dealt with according to the law of those countries. So another fundamental issue that needs to be addressed is Africa needs to feed itself. Today, you see from Nigeria, at least, massive importation of rice from Asia to Africa. Why? We have abundance of rain, we have good climatic conditions that can be used to engage our youth to make sure that we feed ourselves in the continent. One point that I want to highlight also is that Africa is still relevant in the global scheme of things. As highlighted by His Excellency, today is Africa and China, trade and economic relations. Tomorrow is India and Africa. Next tomorrow is Japan and Africa. And in the next 3 days is going to be Russia and Africa. There is need also for us in Africa to sit down and say it is going to be Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria, South Africa, Zaire, Mali, so that we can trade among ourselves, use our own local currencies. It is only then that we can generate employment, not to look outside, but to look inward. in areas where we have to look outside, then we have to maximize the benefit for the good of Africa. On that note, I would like to thank you for giving me the platform to air my opinion on these issues. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I don't know how much time is still available for us. Anyway, I think we can go some minutes on time. Okay, so how much more? 10 minutes. So I see from the applause from the public that those terms that have been used now are really the one that people are looking into. There's one more issue, which is the issue of combating corruption. Corruption, as everybody knows, they will say it is a main plague of Africa. But I'm not, I don't accept that, because and there comes also the issue of using perception index. You know, they will say the index indice de perception de la corruption. That's in French. Means that, in fact, they are not addressing the real core of the subject, but they're addressing the consequences and the appearances that, you know, go around, and they use it to, you know, point a finger to Africa. Corruption is pervasive everywhere, because if there were no corruptors, there would not be corrupt people. So who are corrupting and for which aim? So we need to also now see what are the measures and the mechanism that our governments and our civil society are putting in place to see to it that you know, the environment of doing business is clear from all inadequacies that lead to unfair competition. Address in this term, you can address the issue as a global and general issue, not only pinpoint and finger point the African only. This is one of the questions that also our government should address. What are the means and the mechanism that we put in place to see to it that the environment of doing business in Africa and around Africa are, you know, based on fair terms that can be monitored, that can be measured, and that can also lead to sanction where the need is there. So before, I think my colleague from Ghana has something to add.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'm sure we can spend a whole day on the issue of corruption and the various perceptions that surrounds it, but there are real issues that we need to face when it comes to that. I think the quality of services across, I'm not citing one country, the quality of services that our people need to benefit from is seriously compromised in reality when you look at corruption, whether it's a perception or a reality. In what ways are these services compromised? A contractor gets a contract to construct a road. He or she, thanks for the correction that I need to be more gender sensitive, thank you. He or she has given his estimates of what it will cost for that road to be constructed. It's a reality that somebody sitting somewhere is expecting a portion of this money to come to him or her, he will be obliged, because he wants the contract, to do so. Having done that, of course, the budget estimate has fallen short of what really it requires to give you a good quality road. So he goes ahead to construct the road. He does the shoddy business based on what he has left. And at the end of the day, you have a road that cannot last for 2-3 years. We can cite many examples where we have, because people are not, or just thinking about themselves and not the people that they have to govern, they seriously compromise quality of service to what goes into their pocket. What is the role of government? A government needs to put in place all the regulatory mechanisms. And I can cite an example from Ghana, where the government comes and they say, yes, the press, everybody is talking about corruption. And I think the press needs to be encouraged to give very realistic voice to address the issue of corruption without being partisan or being influenced by an individual or not. But the reality is that the government now says, I have the special prosecutor that I put in place. And he chooses a special prosecutor who is not necessarily from his party. And this person is supposed to bring to book any reports, any questions relating the perception about corruption, to be verified and have competent lawyers and people to assess the real situation. And when a government finds that his minister, his ambassador, whoever he's put there, appointed to serve the people, is found guilty, there are measures put in place as a deterrent. I think these are the kind of things we would be expecting, that when we get into a country to assess really whether there is transparency and there is measures to fight against corruption, we would expect to see this in place, that yes, we are arguing about whether it is real or not, but what are the measures we put in place to check whether it is real or not? And if it is real, what are the measures we put in place to correct them, or put in the necessary punitive measures to put people off? I'm sure many others will want to give a voice to this issue of corruption. So, Your Excellency, Mr. Moderator, I'll bring my contribution to the end here. Thank you.
Okay, Excellency, I think you said it all. Corruption is an issue, global issue, should be addressed. What should be done, everybody knows. But it requires, a global, I would say, a global move, so that we get, away with this. Having said that, I want to reassure you that the outlook for Africa is not depressing. Very smart and intelligent Africans are busy, creating wealth, busy developing the continent. The Sawiris are there, the Dangotes, the Mo Ibrahims, and the young, and vibrant youth that are, building startups. They are there building and creating, what it takes for Africa to become the continent that we all want. What we need is to be focused. What we need is to be consistent, with our vision and with the programs that we are putting in place to see that, the resilience is there. So I will give the floor to our brother, Mr. Abdoulie, to say some few words.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and It was fascinating listening to all of you, highlighting some of the challenges in front of this continent that would facilitate or impede the realization of the Africa we want. Just a few things takeaways I have from you. And I want to start with the issue of corruption. And I think it's a global phenomenon. It's a global cause of concern. But what we should do on the African part is to say, we will do our part. We will make it difficult for ever to push corruption in our countries. When you do that, then, because the other side that, control that you can control, and what you cannot control, you try to minimize its impact. But you made references to security, to various partnerships that we have, to issues of infrastructure. But importantly also, you emphasize the need for further integration. And to integrate this continent, there are 4 elements. One, we must continue debating the type of integration that we want. Even the Europeans who have been on this for 30 years are still debating. And that debate is not happening in Africa. I hope institutions like ECS will push that. So the Africans say, what is that we want? We don't want only the heads of state to determine what you want. So that's one. 2, you must reinforce those institutions that drive integration. African Union, the regional economic communities, and so on. So that must happen. 3rd, you must have shared values, your values. And, Africa has a charter on democracy and so on. How you implement and participate that is, and make sure it's implemented is important. But importantly, you must also deal with issues of a transborder nature. And one prime example of that is the free trade area, free trade that we make that happen. And what are the impediments of this free trade? I think really what is on the floor now, what the heads of states have implemented, makes a lot of sense. It will be a prime example to show to Africans the benefits of coming together. One of the constraints, of course, of this free trade is the free movement of people. You want only goods to move. Goods don't move themselves. Goods are moved by people. So you talked about migration. Our youth who are dying in the seas. Well, you know what? 70% of migration is between African countries. 80%. What we see is dramatic across the Asia. But the bulk is really within Africa. How do you really make sure that this is facilitated and so on? And migrants are not always a burden. I take the case of one country, which is very topical now, and I'm not pointing a finger to them, is South Africa, where we're having these issues of migration. 85% of what the migrants earn in South Africa, they spend in South Africa. 9% of South Africa's GDP is from migrants. 9% of the GDP is contribution. So there's a lot of sense in facilitating migration. we have to bear in mind the security needs of the individual countries and so on. But how you get together and debate this free movement of people is vital. But I am assured, I share your optimism that this is a continent on the move. We have very responsible leadership. They are being accompanied by very talented and dynamic young people. And therefore, we have no doubt, and we are also fully aware of the constraints that we have. So we have no doubt in our mind that we will succeed in building the Africa that we want. On that, I would say, bon appétit. Thank you.